That's up top. There we go. Okay. We've got two locals here, Datagram and Vidiot. Vidiot, who incidentally has, in my opinion, the coolest email address ever, infidel@loljazeera.net. Well, we had a good talk about virtualized forensics earlier, and these guys are going to talk about another sort of potentially non-persistent device and doing forensics on it as well, in this case memory. I'm going to let them talk about it, so you ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we don't have time to talk about who we are, but we're assholes anyway, and we like beer. That's all you need to know. So we're going to go over what live forensics means, the live forensic process, different ways of doing all of this stuff, hardware versus software. We're going to go over analyzing memory dumps offline, and the new hotness is cold boot attacks, which are, well, we'll get into it later. And then we're going to get into cold boot countermeasures so you could try and safeguard yourself from getting this done to you. So to begin, what is live forensics? We all know dead forensics as forensics of a hard drive, analyzing a hard drive out of a compromised machine or whatever kind of machine that you're getting, and trying to figure out what happened to it, what recent activity was going on it. Is anything, trying to evade forensics, because that might be of interest to I do need a beer. There's not much beer in that. To evade detection from, the forensics process in general. Thank you. Okay, now I have beer. Okay, so the one thing we like to prepend this with is that live forensics shouldn't be considered a replacement for dead forensics, but instead append it to whatever you're doing now so that you get, more. So you're not replacing anything, it's just an appendage. I'll move this up here. Okay. Sorry about that. So the advantages and disadvantages of everything are basically going to determine how and where you use it. The good of live forensics is that you get much more information. From a running system, you get a lot of information that you don't get once you turn it off. You also keep the system up, which might be a primary concern for you. A lot of malware it's in its best interest to keep the system up, and also for every business, usually keep the system up. Doing dead forensics means that you have to turn it off, and you're probably going to take out that drive and not use it again. So with live forensics, you're maintaining availability and keeping all your web server, your database, whatever up while you're trying to investigate whatever you're investigating. And another good reason for live forensics is that it combats all the anti-dead forensics techniques that are being used. The talk earlier, virtualization, you might not see that once you unplug the machine, but the VMware image or whatever image is probably going to be in memory. And you could probably extract a good amount of data from that to determine, what's going on in that virtualized process and find out what it's doing to aid in your investigation. But you have little data integrity. You can't trust the system if it's compromised because it's compromised. So anything you could be getting back might be wrong. But on the upside, you can then differentiate between different data that you're pulling from live memory to find discrepancies. Like, well, the kernel data says this about network connections, but when I run netstat, I'm only seeing these connections. So you have some level of integrity, but ultimately you can't completely trust what you're getting. Another problem is that everything you do is going to affect memory. So while your investigation will inevitably somehow alter the data in memory, sometimes overriding evidence that you might need. The other problem is that it's hard to reproduce. You could reproduce after you've taken a dump of the memory, but up until that point, when you connect to the system, log in, start dumping memory, you can't reproduce that at all. And that's a big thing for a lot of people. So what can you find in memory? A lot. You could find what the running kernel is, what modules are loaded, running dead processes that have, been finished execution but are still their, data segments and their text segments still in memory. Network connections, current as well as configuration. Memory mapped files, if like a file has, open text files that it's reading or writing to, you could see those. You could find what users are logged in, firewall settings that might not be stored permanently, web caches, and pretty much lots of random shit. Anything you do is going to be in memory at some point or another, and when you do the forensic process, you probably have a good chance of finding that. So how do we go about doing a live forensics things? A lot of people, as we had earlier, the legal talk, the virtualization talk, there's a lot of concern about the legality and the process to do this so that it holds up in court. And all the regular rules of dead forensics apply. When you get to the machine, you want to take a picture of the screen, you want to label all the cables, you want to, all of that is still going to apply. You're just changing, you're not immediately unplugging the machine and taking a hard drive out. And so the process is basically to dump memory before you do anything else. And then after dumping, you can gather volatile data, like using all your OS level commands to find, netstat, IP tables, all that kind of information. You don't have to do it, but again, like I said earlier, it's good to do because then you could find discrepancies between what your memory dump says and what your administrative tools are saying. And then after that, you power off the machine, go to dead forensics if you want, but eventually you're going to probably want to do an offline analysis of your memory dump to find those discrepancies and to find more information that you might not easily get from all your administrative tools. And then once that all is done, you could probably go ahead with dead forensics. Excuse me, need more beer. So, how to dump memory? A lot of people have trouble getting this through their head that memory is pretty much just a file on every OS that you have, including Windows. So it's trivial to dump, and you could do it either with hardware or software. I'll just go into it. So hardware basically is a device that uses DMA, direct memory access, to bypass the OS to directly access memory, just like it says. And the most popular devices that support it are PCI, PCMCIA, USB, FireWire. There was a thing, which the link leads to, where iPods were used to unlock Windows workstations or to display messages on an OS X machine just by plugging the device in, and then it overwrites certain parts of memory that would control whether or not the screen's locked or what's displaying, what's next executing. But it can be defeated. The paper referenced here is basically a really technical thing that I don't want to get into, where it just has the CPU reroute DMA requests and you can forge them. Basically what it is. If you want more information, by all means look her up. So the other thing, which is probably more practical for the majority of you, is software dumping. And like I said, all memory in every OS is referenced by a file. In Unix, it's devmem. In Linux, kcore, devmem. OS X, same thing. Windows also has this. The asterisks are there because in newer versions of OS X, you have to pass a boot parameter to enable devmem and devkmem devices. And in Windows, as of Vista, they're not normally allowing access to that file. So on XP 2003, older than that, you can do it. On Vista, you'd have to enable it as well. So at the bottom is an example of just using DD. I mean, it's just a file. All you need to do is copy the bytes and just copy it to an image. So software takes a lot more preparation to do than hardware dumping, because with hardware dumping, you've already written the driver for your hardware device, and all it does is copy all the memory, and then you unplug it. With software, you need to prepare more. You need to create a trusted toolkit of statically compiled binaries, because you don't want to use what the OS is giving you, because they might have modified DD to give you junk back when you DD devmem or whatever. You also, if you don't want to store it locally, like on a flash drive or some kind of device, you want to prepare a netcat session on the other end, or a cryptcat if you want to encrypt your session. You might want to consider using scripts so that Your memory footprint is less just because you're not sitting there in the shell, repeatedly entering commands, because all that's going to go in the terminal frame buffer and the bash buffer and all that. So you're overwriting more than you want to. With the script, it's just one command, and then you can log out of the system. The main thing here is just to understand what you're doing and remember your goals. Your goal is to just get the information as quickly as possible without affecting memory as quickly as possible. So a script is a really good way to do that. So assuming you've made your memory dump using BD, now you want to gather live info. So the disclaimer here is that if you're qualified to give a live forensics investigation, you're qualified to know what those commands are in a system that gets you information. Because I could put, PS, netstat, all these commands, but you should know that already, how to get all the information you want. And what information you want is specific to your needs. But the main thing is to use your trusted commands, your statically compiled data. Remember path. A lot of malware might modify path to try and trick you into... Thank you. Yeah, but you know what? He got us beer. Oh, I don't think it's going to like that at all. Yeah!
This is way better than your live demo last year.
I know. You could see this one.
Yeah.
Okay, so remember path. A lot of malware modifies paths to try and get you to execute things in different directories. So you might think you're running your DD. Generally, what you want to do is just skip path altogether and use full path names for everything you execute, just because that's much easier, and you don't have to overwrite path, which would, again, modify your memory. And then once you've gathered all your live info, you want to store that locally on the hard drive or flash drive you have, or NCAT or CryptCat to a remote system. Remember to MD5 hash all of the live info as well as the memory dump, just so that you could, say this is exactly what I got at a later date. And then specific to software stuff, you might want to look for rootkits in a security compromise kind of situation. It's generally you want to identify that it's compromised as soon as possible and then just pull it offline. So there's a bunch of tools. Rootkit Hunter, the only note is that you have to have it installed before you run it, or else there's no point in running it because it'll just profile your existing system and then look for changes later. So there's also a kernel module to look for rootkits. 99 Luftballons was released at TourCon 9 last year, and it's a really, really cool tool for finding kernel rootkits. And then, again, manual inspection. If you don't want to use any of the tools, you could do it. Again, consider scripting it just to make it faster, smaller memory footprint. So you've dumped memory. You've done your administrative stuff to get all that data. Now you have all this data to go through, and you're going to analyze it offline. It's more or less reverse engineering if you're going to disassemble the memory dump manually. That's all it is. It's just consider it one big-ass ELF file. And then, besides that, there's certain things you might want to do. You might want to string search. Tried and true, very simple to do. Strings, grep. There's specialized algorithms. If you don't want to use strings or grep, a lot of forensics toolkits will have this. Ncase has one. I think FTK has one as well. Usually hilarious. And the reason for that is shell histories are hilarious of compromised machines. So we'll begin with, as you see at the top, where's my mouse? Right here, the compromise. This is an actual log from a live forensics thing that I did. He's in dev SHM, which is a virtual file system in Linux, so it won't touch the hard drive at all. So you could already see that they're using anti-dead forensic stuff, but I still catch him. So we get his full path from PS1. He installs his bot. He tries to run vhost, no such file directory. Okay. So he spells it right, permission denied, owned by UMask, non-executable by default. He goes and he makes everything executable for everyone and then runs it, but apparently you can't run IP addresses as commands. It doesn't work like that. So, okay, he runs some other program, no output. This is data from the terminal buffer, so you see literally what they see as they're going through the shell. And then he runs do, but he doesn't know how to run do, so he should RTFM, right? And then another similar investigation was this guy trying to log out. Now, as you know, in Linux and Unix, you can't log out if there's stop jobs. It doesn't like that. So unset his file. Again, evading dead forensics of his shell history. Exit, log out, there's stop jobs. Okay, well, let's try it again. There's stop jobs. This went on for like 40 lines, and he couldn't log out. It was really, really good. So again, hilarity often ensues. It's a good motivator to keep you going because it's a lot of data to sort through. The next thing would be file carving. If they have open memory mapped files, you can carve them out of memory, just like it sounds. There's a lot of free tools to do this. Scalpel, foremost. Commercial tools, Ncase has a file carver. FTK has a file carver. Most forensics toolkits have their own magical file carver, and they're all pretty much the same thing, where they just look for a certain header and then a certain footer, or a certain header and then 5 megs after that will be the file. And then if you want to get even, the most intense you could get about this is interpreting all the kernel structures from your memory dump. And all the same stuff you get from your administrative tools will be there. PS will be there. Netstat will be there. All the stuff in proc, all that information is probably going to be in memory. The problem is that there's few ready-to-use Linux tools. There's a lot of Windows tools to do this. iDetect was a proof of concept for 2.4 kernels. It doesn't work in 2.6, but you could just read Understanding the Linux Kernel by O'Reilly, which is really informative. And for me, I come from like an assembly background, so it's not too hard to wrap my head around kernel structures. Hopefully not for you either. And then the guy who wrote iDetect also has a paper, if you want to read his paper and apply it to 2.6. Basically just how the tool works and how it grabs all this stuff out of that kernel dump. So the next part of our talk will be the cold boot attacks, and that's all Vidiot.
Thank you. All right, I'm just going to give we're intending this talk basically as an introduction to cold boot attacks. We're by no means experts in this. This is something that came out of a paper that was published by Princeton University in conjunction with the EFF and with Wind River Systems back in February. And we want to stress this is not our research. This is something that kind of sent a shockwave through the forensics community when it came out. And we just want to make you aware of it. Many of you probably already are. Essentially, what a cold boot attack is a way to attack a whole disk encryption system. And it's based on the unexpectedly long decay rate of DRAM memory. For a long time, people have assumed that when you shut off your computer, everything in memory is gone immediately. And that's just not the case. And in fact, using some of the techniques that the team at Princeton put together, it's actually very plausible to attack a system that's been even shut down for a while, using some of their tools for reconstructing decayed memory. And the takeaway here is that just about every disk encryption system is vulnerable right now. BitLocker, FileVault, TrueCrypt, etc. So DRAM remnants effects. The first thing to understand here is that they're different from what you might be familiar with the Gutman burn-in effect, where a semiconductor holds a value for a certain amount of time and then it picks it up easier later, or it's easier to detect. This is actually slightly different. This has to do with how long it takes the MOSFETs to actually decay when the system is turned off. And as I said before, assuming that decay is instantaneous will result in failure. So let's see. Memory decay occurs as the MOSFETs return to their ground state. And the ground state in the RAM can be a 0 or a 1, depending on which way the capacitor is wired inside the memory. Complete decay can tend to equal several thousand refresh cycles. Normally when the computer is operating, the system will go through and refresh each capacitor in the RAM to keep the memory in state as the programs are running. When it's shut down, it takes a while for that to bleed out. And it can take several thousand refresh cycles for that to happen. The decay rate is also a function of temperature. The warmer the RAM is, the faster it'll decay. And there's a pattern that tends to happen, which is slow, fast, slow. Decay rate starts off slow, accelerates through a curve, and then tails off. And also higher density or newer RAM tends to decay faster. So what we're looking at here, let me see if I can take this thing over here so I can gesture at it. I don't know if this will reach.
Do you want me to gesture?
What you're looking at here, this is taken from the Princeton paper. It's an image that has been pulled out of memory over different periods of time, 5 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute, and 5 minutes. And you can see these white and black lines. This is memory decaying to its ground state 0 or 1. Sorry. And why this is important is because the eventual state of any particular MOSFET can often be predicted. Also, the relative order of decay often stays constant regardless of temperature. I believe what they're referring to in the paper, if you notice in these images here in the middle, you can kind of see some striations heading up and down. These are banks of MOSFETs that are decaying at a slightly different rate from their neighbors, but you'll notice there's patterns. And what this means is that after you've captured an image out of the RAM, even if it's decayed, you can then go back after the RAM is fully decayed, run algorithms that will look at the exact RAM sticks that you're analyzing and start to build values for how soon each MOSFET is likely to decay, which will help you then go back and isolate and rebuild the decayed memory. It's a very interesting technique they came up with. So essentially for cold boot attacks, the Princeton team identified 3 types. First one is just a simple reboot. Plug your memory stick into the computer, hit the power button. Now, this has the advantage of being fast and very easy. However, it has a downside that data can be destroyed during the shutdown process, and you also are going to possibly overwrite some of the RAM as the system comes back up. The second type of attack is essentially exactly the same, except instead of shutting down and rebooting, you go for a hard power cut, just like you normally did in old school dead system forensics. Again, this has the side effect, the downside of overwriting some memory in RAM as the system comes back up, although it does overcome the shutdown problem. The third type of attack, which is the most powerful, is actually transplanting the DRAM out of the system into an analysis machine. The Princeton team identified an interesting little technique where they took a can of canned air, turned it upside down, and just hosed off the RAM in the machine before they pulled it out, and it gave them more than enough time to easily transplant it to an analysis machine, start it back up, and pull all the data out. In fact, as a test, they did this, hosed off the RAM, and then dipped it in liquid nitrogen and left it alone for an hour. Pulled it out, stuck it in their analysis machine, and after an hour, there was only a 0.17% decay rate. So it starts to get a little scary when you think about how easy it might be for someone to walk in, seize your encrypted drive and your RAM, and be able to get away scot-free. And there's also a type of a hybrid attack they suggested here at the bottom, a network attack through PXE. And the scenario they give is if you compromise a server, set it up as a PXE boot server, and then through a DOS or a software compromise cause other systems to reboot and come up off of that, you could use the PXE boot server to run a memory dumper and pull the memory out of those machines. A scenario they suggest for that would be recovering SSL secret keys out of a web server. Now, the main problem is going to be locating the keys in memory. Now, this is actually pretty standard stuff you've seen before. One of the best techniques they identified was just searching for known contents or known structure. You know, for example, searching for a known public modulus might also give you the private key, or searching for known encoding formats might expose the key. This is standard stuff that's been around for a while. But they also came up with another interesting technique, which is what is called using the Hamming distance in data. In information theory, the Hamming distance is the number of positions for which corresponding symbols are different between two strings of equal length. Now, for binary strings, that's very simple. It's just A XOR B. We're all familiar with that if we've studied any kind of cryptography. It's a very fast, very simple mathematical calculation. And what this does, as you can see with these two strings here, they're only 2 bits apart on each string. So that gives you a Hamming distance of 2 when you XOR them together. By looking at decayed memory, if you're trying to go back and find potential keys, this technique's very powerful. And I'm not aware of it being applied anywhere else before, where you can take what you believe are possible keys, maybe none of which work. By using the Hamming distance, you can very quickly isolate which bits are likely the decayed ones, and then very quickly go through and brute force what remains as possibilities and reconstruct the key from potentially seriously decayed memory. So countermeasures for this. There are a few. They're not very good. Scrubbing memory, obviously. Avoid storing keys in memory if you can, or get rid of them when they're no longer needed. Alternatively, if you can, You can configure your system to perform a destructive memory test on boot. Go through the full boot on, or the full memory test on post, use ECC RAM, something that if the system is actually rebooted, it's going to destroy the state in the memory. That will defend against a couple of these attacks. It won't defend against an attack where the RAM is physically removed and planted in an analysis machine. Let's see, where was I? Oh, and limiting booting from network or remote movable media is also going to help. The idea here being that you want to slow down the attacker because time is of the essence as far as the RAM decaying. So if you can do things to help prevent them from being able to just walk in, put in a memory stick, hit the power button, and grab data, that's going to help you. Using a password or a key to wake a system. Simply suspending a computer into sleep mode is not going to buy you anything because all the attacker has to do is touch the mouse, wake the system, and then reboot it, and he's got what's in your RAM. Hibernation can also be vulnerable unless an external secret is required. Because hibernation is basically just suspending to disk. If you don't need an external secret to re-wake the machine, it just takes a little longer for it to come back up, and they're going to have your data. And TPM systems are also vulnerable. In fact, the Princeton team confirmed that BitLocker in its default mode was completely vulnerable to this. BitLocker in advanced mode, however, was not because it requires a secret to reawaken. Another set of countermeasures, avoiding precomputation. Precomputation can speed up cryptographic processes, but it tends to leave a lot of key remnants sitting around in various places in memory, which of course is going to make the attacker's job easier because they're going to have more pieces of data to use to try to reconstruct your keys. Also, key expansion. Applying some kind of transformation to the key before you store it in memory. The idea here is to obfuscate it to make it harder for the attacker to then find when they go back and they're looking through your memory. This is not a great solution, though, because any transformation you apply to the key, the mechanism for applying the transformation is probably also in the RAM. So if you have a really dedicated attacker, they're probably going to be able to find it and still get your data. Architectural changes, and personally I think this is where the solution is going to have to come from ultimately, which is building DRAM with faster decay rates, building key management hardware into motherboards so that it never touches the RAM, or encrypting the contents of the RAM entirely so pulling it out still just gives you nothing but gibberish. The problem is none of these will help with current technology. Current machines are this does not apply. This is something hardware manufacturers are going to have to do in the future. And I'm really hoping they jump on it. Encryption in the disk controller is something we're starting to see happening, and it's possibly a viable way to combat this. If you enable a key register that's write-only that uses some type of symmetric key that's written into that register, and then that key is used to write the data blocks on the drive, then all the encryption takes place in the drive. The key never touches RAM, then you have a chance of keeping the bad guys out. Now, trusted computing, there's been a lot of talk as far as TPMs and forensics and problems that's posed. However, with this new technique, the TPM has become in some ways a little bit irrelevant. TPMs do not implement bulk encryption. A TPM cannot encrypt all the data on your hard drive. What a TPM does is monitor the boot process, determine whether or not the system came up in an approved state, and then release a key to then decrypt the drive. So it can prevent a key from being loaded into RAM, but once it's there, it can't protect it. So if an attacker can get to your system in the right configuration, the TPM is not going to be able to do anything to help you out. Now, this is my favorite one. Physical defenses. There's all kinds of silliness you can get into as far as protecting your computer on a physical level. One of the things the Princeton team suggested was encasing your RAM in epoxy, make it impossible to take out of the system. Why not? Trip switches, accelerometers, RFID, go nuts, completely hack up your box on a hardware level. And these are things that might be able, pass that on over. This is something I came up, we were at one of the meets talking about this back in February when this paper first came out, and this is one of the dumb ideas I came up with. I know you probably know what this is because I see the sticker on the front of your laptop. This is a Parallax Basic Stamp Kit. Anyone here familiar with them, aside from him? 3, 4 people? What? Yes, they attended that last meeting. A parallax BASIC stamp is essentially a small microcontroller that can be programmed in BASIC. It's great if you like to tinker with electronics because you can do a lot of logic that would take you days to implement in hardware with just a couple lines of code and still drive other electronic devices. I happen to be a big fan of parallax. This is actually the same processor that's used on the Mystery Box Challenge at DEF CON because this company makes about a zillion little accessories to go on these things. Mostly it's aimed at the robot hobbyist market, but they have everything from sound detectors, motion detectors, you name it, on down the line, that you can hook right up to these. In this case, I've hooked up a 3-axis accelerometer. Now imagine if I put this in my machine.
Pretend this is a laptop.
Yeah, here, pretend this. Wait, that's not going to work. I had this problem before. The buzzer makes it set itself off. There we go. Yeah, this is probably not something that's going to be easy to implement in a laptop. You're going to need some room. But the idea we came up with was to try to build a self-destructing PC that was complete with all the self-destructing hardware, not implemented in software running in the operating system, not in the hardware of the PC itself, something running completely separate that was going to be able to disable and destroy your data if someone came in and tried to seize your machine. People have tried to do this before. I've seen all kinds of crazy ideas. There was some guy, I think it was on Hackaday, who proposed hooking your hard drive up to a 20-gauge shotgun shell. I don't recommend that. And for some reason, every time I brought this up at one of our meets, the first word I hear is? Thermite, right. Thank you. I think I heard it from somebody who wasn't at our meet, which just proves my point. Oh, there you go. So I can't remember. It might have been you, actually. Someone at Hackaday.
I never said anything about shotgun shells.
No. Someone at Hackaday proposed a separate type of countermeasure, which was hooking up a tube of binary epoxy with a mechanical actuator that, when triggered, would just fill your drive with epoxy. I built one as a proof of concept. It was a total failure. I am not a machinist.
To clarify, it worked.
Once. A little sooner than I wanted it to. So it's possible. I will tell you the two major problems I came up with was trying to find an actuator strong enough to push the epoxy down, and the other one was trying to get enough volume out of the thing to actually fill it up and cover both platters. It's harder than it sounds to do. Anyway, yes. That's the other idea. We just were talking about this. We thought, how funny would it be to watch some guy trying to carry your computer out to his seizure van while there's polyurethane foam spraying out of all the vents? Maybe little flags waving on it, you know. Sparklers. So among, getting back to the parallax system, what I have here is just the basic parallax stamp running about 10 lines of code hooked to a 3-axis accelerometer. It's probably the simplest way you could use to trigger a system like this. I have it hooked to a buzzer, which you all know about, which is probably not working. There we go. I was tuning this thing last night in my hotel room after many beers, so don't blame me if it doesn't work right. The idea here is this is just... Shut up. The idea here is that this is just one of about 1 million possible ways you could hook up your hardware with some kind of device that would protect you from this. And the Princeton team, when they wrote the paper, actually said that physical countermeasures are probably one of the best ways to do this, and they suggested that there's about 1 million ways to do it, and they're absolutely right. And if you're a tinkerer like me, you like playing with electronics, this is a lot of fun. Let me pass that box down here. Just to give you an idea of the kind of junk that Parallax sells that I just can't get enough of. Let's see. If you're worried about someone sticking a probe into your case to cut the wires, PIR sensor to detect movement. Have that trigger the system. These are digital thermometers. Detect someone trying to spray off your RAM and cool it. That can be a trigger. There's about 100 million other ones in here. Oh, yes. Well, it's buried. Trust me, it's way at the bottom.
I'll find it.
One of the ideas that came up at our last meet was using an RFID reader inside your case and just hiding the chip outside the case as a proximity, basically a proximity trigger. As soon as it stops sensing that chip, boom. I know. Exactly, a proximity fuse. Datagram really likes RFID, so bear with us. There you go. And this is the RFID card reader. It's pretty cheap, works well. You should all buy stuff from Parallax. I love those guys.
Business PCs have case intrusion switches too.
Yes, and you could tie on to the existing case intrusion switch. Absolutely. So that concludes pretty much all my silliness. Does anyone have any questions for us? Or wait, actually, let's let Data do his conclusions first. Then you can bring up questions.
Good work. Good work. So the conclusions we want you to draw from this is exercise caution. Knowing what you're doing is really the biggest thing in both the live memory stuff as well as the cold boot attacks, as well as defenses. Neither of these things should be a solution. They should be an addition to whatever you're already including. You also need to think about physical security. With the cold boot attacks, if they're already getting to your system in the first place, that's probably more of a problem than what they're going to do when they're taking apart your RAM. And then again, have fun. Good luck on all your live forensics as well as cold boot attacks / defenses. And, whoa, not quite. Q&A?
The legality behind self-destruct of your PC.
He asked what the legality is about destroying your own PC. The phrase you want to use is data theft prevention. And that's, you could talk to the guy who gave the lawyer talk. I'm sure he'll have better information for you. But data theft prevention.
What else? We're good, no questions.
Or we suck.
Oh, we suck.
Is that it?
That's it?
Did it? That's what it said at the beginning. We suck.
We like your...
We like full beers, though. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your time.